Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts and our minds be pleasing to you, O God, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. I invite you to be seated this morning. Welcome to this, the Feast of the Epiphany, where we celebrate these wise men who parade our creche scenes all season, having traveled from afar with their gifts for the baby king, following the star as it led them to Bethlehem in Judea. It's a well-worn story this time of year, but it's easy in our world to miss the impact of the Feast of the Epiphany. We can hallmark the story, if you'll allow me to use that as a verb. We can hallmark the story if we're not careful, and we'll take the teeth right out of it. We might think it a soft and cuddly story, but the truth is, Epiphany has some bite. There's evidence of that in Matthew's Gospel this morning, as you heard, as Herod hears the news of a baby king. Matthew tells us he is filled with fear, and all of Jerusalem with him. The story is ultimately a story of colliding worlds clashing. It's a story of the world of fear colliding with the world of wonder. The fear of Herod the Great, it fuels him. And it will fuel him to madness. If you read further along in the Gospel of Matthew, after the Magi leave by another road and do not return to Herod, he commits infanticide in all of Jerusalem. So the fear of Herod the Great, and then the wonder of the Magi. Wonder that pushes them on through their long journey to meet Jesus. Herod the Great, he was a puppet king. He was put in place by the famous Roman general Mark Antony, who was at this time the ruler of Rome's eastern provinces. Herod's family had converted to Judaism for the purpose of appeasing the masses in Jerusalem, but he was a ruthless leader who would go to any lengths to protect his power. Fear drove him deep down. His fear, his concern upon hearing the news of the arrival of the Magi to come and see the king, unmasks the depth of his fragility. Herod knows that his position, it requires constant vigilance, that any change can mean the end of his rule, the loss of power. And so Herod rules in fear by employing fear as a means of securing that power. Enter the Magi, traveling from far, full of wonder, an inquiring people who longed after wisdom in whatever form it came to them. And so it's wonder, a yearning for wisdom which leads them to Jesus on that long journey. It was wonder which drove them to Bethlehem, that backwater small town, far too rural to mean anything important. Wonder brought them there, brought them to that house. Wonder at the sort of king who would be born in such a place as that. Wonder led them there. And when they arrived, Matthew tells us they were overwhelmed with joy. The verbal construct that Matthew uses here tells us that they literally erupted with joy. They exploded with joy. In the presence of this king, fear breeds despair, but wonder breeds joy. Fear and wonder, the fear of those in authority that will lead to Jesus' death, that fear is present in his birth. The wonder that this king will arouse from those around him throughout his life in the Gospels, it first comes from these outsiders. There's Herod risen to power, who will protect it at all costs, reigning from the safety of his palace, firmly in the direct center of power. And there's these magi from the outside, the periphery, who come to Nowheresville to meet this Jesus who will teach the movement of power as not one of upward mobility, but of power as downward mobility. Leading not through coercion, but leading through servanthood. One who exercises his rule not from the center of power and security, but from the vulnerable periphery and ultimately the desecration of the cross. It's all there in this story, the whole gospel. Fear and wonder. I think this Jesus still evokes both of these responses in our world. We live in a world beset by fear. It's everywhere. The despair that's bred by fear threatens us at every turn. The geopolitics of Jesus' day is not so different than ours. Fear won't magically disappear. It's insidious, it's deep. It affects each and every one of us. It's a commodity in this world. It's traded like currency, and the world is buying. So how do we see Jesus? Like the Magi as gift, or like Herod as threat? Some days I react like these Magi. I'm overwhelmed by the simple beauty of life, by the presence of God in my life, in my family's life, in the life of this community and what it does. I'm overwhelmed with joy at the beauty of God's love. But on other days, if I'm honest, I feel like Herod. I fear because I'm often unseated by what I don't know. I'm often dethroned by situations made to understand that I'm not in control. That inevitably, no matter how hard I try to stay in control, I will be surprised, which can be an uncomfortable thing. You know it. On days like those, God is for me a threat to my desire for control. So whether we know it or not, whether we acknowledge it or not this morning, we need the vulnerability, the peace, the tenderness of this King to disrupt this fear, to quiet it, to destroy it, and to drive it out. Epiphany is our call to wonder, to seek and to follow, to learn of the strange rule of this King Jesus. And friends, this is where the rubber hits the road. It's a hard lesson to learn to greet the reality that we aren't the lords of our lives with joy and not with fear. We spend our lives trying to make sure that everything comes out right, that we're the kings and queens of our own domain. It's not easy to fall off that throne and to be glad about it. But that's the witness of the Magi. They know Christ is Lord, and they respond in joy. And that's the witness of Herod as well for us, because he's right at least on one thing. If this Jesus is Lord, Herod without doubt is not. If this Jesus is Lord, the Herods of our world will ultimately fall. If this Jesus is Lord, I most certainly am not, and neither are you. That's the gift of Epiphany, the manifestation that Christ and Christ alone is Lord of our lives and of this world. And if this Jesus stuff seems strange to you this morning as you're sitting here, but perhaps intriguing, and you're wondering what he's all about, I invite you to wonder your way into his reality, into his way, like those Magi so long ago. On the Feast of the Epiphany, we celebrate the whole of the gospel story. We make the seemingly reckless declaration that tenderness triumphs, that love wins, that vulnerability is what majesty and power is really made of. And with the prophet Isaiah, we proclaim that our light has come, and in it we are enlightened, and in thanksgiving we rejoice. Thanks be to God. Amen.